Okay, wake you up. Okay, so every speaker has to make an assumption about their audience, and you're an entirely new audience for me, so hopefully I will talk about something which is directly of relevance and interest to you. I do have a fair bit of interest and experience with archives from various perspectives. As a government employee, I've been involved in anonymously creating archives that are of archival significance, as well as reviewing up files that have been created by other people. As an academic, I do a lot of historical research, accessing archives, public and corporate archives. And as a legal researcher, I've done a lot of work that touches on issues concerning Indigenous people and their access to archives, as well as issues around abuses of Indigenous people's cultural rights. And as a lawyer, lastly, I've got a lot of IP expertise, and I've worked on policy areas around opening up access. So what I'm going to do today is talk about issues that draw upon all that personal experience, and it is primarily a personal story that I'm telling today. So when it arrives, this is a quote from an Aboriginal academic called Blaise Kwame-Lina, and he wrote this as a response to his own experience as an Aboriginal researcher looking at files that were created by colonial soldiers who were watching Aboriginal men in the watch house at Roban Prison. These were the men that were keeping Aboriginal people in those very barbaric neck chains and leg chains. I chose not to use the image because I think it is overused, but also because what he was actually looking at was the diaries. And his work talks to the question about what is an archive? Is it history? Is it information? Is it a record of colonial violence? Is it family history? But he was also concerned in this article here about how the record affects the reader and the viewer, and in particular how these records impact upon Indigenous people who, due to colonial history, so frequently find themselves as unwitting subjects of public archives. Blaise's work particularly resonated with me because it reminds me of my very first proper job out of law school, which was working on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. My job was to see that the Royal Commission had full access to the documentary record of interactions between the deceased and the state, people who died in police custody or in prison. Many of the deaths had recorded open coronial verdicts, and many had also recorded repeated suspicions, similar suspicions over the nature of the deaths. Now, even though as a student of the 80s at Macquarie, I knew my Foucault and other criminological work about the state and how the state had always had a very intrusive interest in the lives of marginalised people, I really was not prepared for the extraordinary volume of material that recorded what were in fact incredibly unremarkable lives. Records from all areas, school, welfare, hospitals, criminal records, but also for the intimacy of many of those details. Secondly, I got increasingly upset watching the families in court, in particular the family of the first person whose death was investigated, which is a young man called Eddie Murray. One of the family's motivations was to have an injustice addressed. They believed their son had been murdered by police. But another of their ambitions, I believe, was to try and correct the stories that were being told and repeatedly told and retold in the Royal Commission about their son. Briefly, the family and all the evidence from those who knew him well had said that he was a very happy-go-lucky person, that he was very much looking forward to a footy tour in New Zealand for which he'd been recently selected. And what they wanted to do is contest the official narrative of Mr. Murray's life as a sad, depressed drinker with few prospects, living in a racist country town, and a man who, at the Royal Commission found, had been influenced by the notion of being picked upon by the state. And then the state said that's why he took his own life. Contesting the narrative was simply not possible because the archive had already framed Mr. Murray, and the story had very real consequences for the way the Royal Commission conducted its inquiry, and also for several later inquiries into new evidence, and including Police Integrity Commission findings about his death. Mr. Murray's family is still publicly calling for a reopening of the case, which is now 34 years after his suspicious death. In the aftermath of the Royal Commission, there was conferences held amongst family members to discuss what had happened through the Commission process. And one family member, Alice Nicky, said, one of the problems of the Royal Commission was that they didn't give us a chance to talk, they just brought up all our memories for nothing. So I think one of the first things we need to recognise in talking about ethics and archives, that this is often a living record of people's lives. As Rebecca said at the beginning, the archive is just much more than a resource or a repository. The re-traumatising and disappointment created by the Royal Commission was considered by those establishing the Stolen Generations inquiry a decade later. The demand this time was when the state is going to create a new state record, it wouldn't operate just for the state's own benefit. So the ambition was to create an archive for the benefit of future generations so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians would more fully appreciate the history of colonialism and the impact on the people of the land. Another ambition was obviously also to help Indigenous people access their own records for their own purposes, which has led to a significant change in institutional practices related to the sharing of stories and the opening up of official records. During and following the inquiry, there was considerable pressure on Stolen Generations to seize their moment in history, to come forward, tell of the abuse they suffered, and to have that wrong acknowledged. But for one member of the Stolen Generation at least, this proved rather catastrophic. A few years ago, I was asked as an IP lawyer to help a man who'd given evidence to the Stolen Generations inquiry. He had wanted the extensive and horrific abuse he'd suffered to be on the public record, but he actually travelled interstate to give evidence because he didn't want to expose his young family to knowledge of his suffering sexual and physical abuse whilst he was institutionalised. This man also used link-up and freedom of information laws to try and obtain information about how he came to be in care, what his real birth name was, and so on. He then shared this information with a non-Indigenous person who'd befriended him. He'd been discussing with her Aboriginal politics and spirituality, and they were thinking about collaborating in an art gallery venture. This unethical person then self-published a book, quoting from much of his evidence at the Royal Commission, identifying him, and also quoting from other personal documentation, which revealed many of the private details he'd been able to discover about his early life and circumstances. Australia has very, very weak privacy laws. And in this particular case, this man had muddied the water to some extent because he had agreed to share some of this information being disclosed. As a copyright lawyer, I had to tell him that copyright left him completely unprotected. Copyright, in providing a private incentive to the author to publish an original literary work, just encouraged his ongoing dehumanisation and degradation. As I said at the bottom, copyright mobilised the thief to speak of him, about him, and speak for him. So what he was in reality was just reduced to an authentication device. He provided some kind of cultural flavour, colour if you like, emotional valence to a very crappy self-published book. And it's not really about whether it's a good book or not. This book circulated in the community where he lived. And there was simply nothing that could be done legally, and it had a terrible impact on him, on his family, and on the community that he lived in. So one of my motivations in wanting to talk to you today is in discussing ethics, it's important to note that Australia has done a lot of work around opening up institutions, developing appropriate cultural protocols, and other practices that are very important. But what does not seem to be fully acknowledged yet is that copyright law has the potential to undercut a lot of the good work that has been done there and to continue to cause very great harm. In the spirit of reconciliation, Indigenous Australians are encouraged to share their personal stories so we still understand Aboriginal identity and place and the nation's history. And I think we all need to talk about this a lot more because opening up access can be very dangerous for the person, for the family, and the communities that are left exposed. There is also some problems with bequest conditions that create an internal conflict, in my view, between the institutional post-colonial practices and legal obligations of those who donate material. And I became aware of this when I was asked by the artist Trevor Nichols to help find out how come some of his personal diaries and early drawings had ended up on display as part of this retrospective exhibition that toured a few years ago. What ended up being on display was a lot of sketches and early drawings that he'd done as an art student that he would never ever have consented to agree to be displayed in public. They were very personal and they were explorations of his own Aboriginality. I don't think I probably have time to go into it in a lot more detail here, but in short, there were a range of legal avenues we could have pursued, but these were not followed up because he was concerned to be seen, as Aboriginal people so often have historically through the archival records of the state, as difficult, as unprofessional, as a hopelessly confused Aborigine. It made him really, really upset because what it actually meant that the retrospective, which for him was incredibly important as a what retrospectively ended up being a kind of towards the end of his artistic career, meant that his legacy was represented, constructed by and for non-Indigenous eyes, which were inviting reflections on his very personal identity as an Aboriginal man based on items that he was very, very uncomfortable being on display. Okay. That's all a bit bleak, so I thought I should round out on a more positive note. Okay, this is a newspaper article, there've been quite a few, about a English author who's written a controversial and dangerous new book, Losing Their Marbles. Her name's Tiffany Jenkins. Losing Their Marbles is a reference to the Elgin marbles, but apparently she's also unaware that in the context of the Indigenous material that she's talking about, it also has another connotation. I've got a review of it coming out in the Indigenous Law Bulletin if people are interested in knowing a little bit more about this book. But for now, what's worth mentioning about the work and why it's a positive story is that her book is designed with the British Museum's collection in mind, and it's speaking to a concern that the key educated sections of the public, many researchers and curators who work within the world's largest museums, are now sympathetic to post-colonial politics. And so it's been recognised that these mausoleums, like the British Museum, are stuffed to the brim with other people's stuff. Other peoples and nations and communities' arts, cultural objects, and, as we know, still human remains. Her concern is that through successful advocacy, much of this bounty has now been repatriated. So whenever these objects get exhibited, there are embarrassing protests that get sympathetic mainstream media coverage. Most recently, the British Museum's BP-sponsored Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilizations exhibition, which these images come from, and the related National Museum of Australia's Encounters exhibition. And of course, one of the more interesting things is the other thing that's often reported in the press is that these protests particularly upset exhibition sponsors. Why I think this is a positive story is that whilst there still remains a lot to be done to repatriate First Nations cultural property and human remains, and this is a long and drawn out and difficult path requiring ongoing vigilance and attentiveness, Jenkins' book, her rallying cry that basically people working in museums need to man the barricades, is a reminder that people's efforts in the past, and the efforts particularly of people in settler communities like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, have actually met with considerable success. We are shifting the discourse and changing curatorial practices, and I think that is no small matter. So, in finishing off, I thought I should explain the title of my paper. For me, the point of ethical discourse in this space is not really about opening up collections or even making it possible to tell different stories from these collections, in particular where the Aboriginal subject's not presented as an animal or a plant. For me, it's about making the archive safer, where the archive is understood as a living record of people's lives and tied up with complex identity claims due to colonial violence. And whilst institutional ethical practice is important here, we shouldn't actually forget the way that copyright law can interfere with those post-colonial aspirations. For me, this means that we have to be ensure that users, in particular Indigenous users of the archive, are not misled about the dangers along the path that can come from sharing their stories in public. Because courtesy of Australian laws, Indigenous peoples can be very easily transformed back into being mere informants or memory machines that serve the colonial past. And I think we all strive to do much better than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was fantastic. Our next talk is going to be from Agatha Gothe-Snape, and she is her conceptual practice stems from improvisational performance and draws upon records and interpersonal and spatio-emotional exchanges around art and art contexts. And she uses ephemeral materials and subtle alterations of space. She uses language and choreography as her chosen mediums to question our relationships to one another, to art, and to the context and histories, i.e. archives, in which all these are situated. So, Agatha.
It is good morning, everyone. It is hard not to cringe a little at the art speak in my bibliography. So, please excuse. Again, of course, I'm not entirely sure of the makeup of you, my audience, and so bear with me as I present here. Also following Kathy, that was such a brilliant presentation, and it's actually really brought some things into my mind that make me begin to even question what I'm about to talk about. So I just like to really thank you for that. So let me see this. A very long-time collaborator and peer of mine is this gentleman. His name is Brian Fuata. He is a performer and a writer and a choreographer and a visual artist. Recently, Brian, via email, invited a group of friends, colleagues and peers to hold up a piece of blank paper in a gallery. This gallery is called Nulp. It's an artist-run gallery in Camperdown. His invitation was for his friends, this is him demonstrating, to hold up this paper for a specified amount of time. Each participant would therefore arrive at the gallery and use their own strength, their weight, or at least their manipulation of the forces of gravity, to hold down this single sheet of paper. This sheet of paper was blank. This work was entitled Paper Weights, W-A-I-T-S, and it was not only about the vacant space upon the paper's surface, but also about the complex social and relational spaces every work is scaffolded onto. The bodies that in this work held Brian's paper explicitly also support the work implicitly by attending openings, viewing the art objects, speaking to and about the works, and perhaps making their own works in conscious and unconscious response, also by contextualizing Brian's work historically. The paper was therefore suspended by this relational scaffold throughout the exhibition's duration. This network became the infrastructure or support of the work, both conceptually and physically. It was this group of people that quite literally held the work up, made the work possible, and created a frame of reverence and reference for the work's content, a blank sheet. At the conclusion of the exhibition, the exercise of suspension was complete, and the sheet of paper was returned to the stack within the gallery. When Brian visited my house 3 days ago, I noticed he had a book in his bag called No Medium. Upon its cover was a photograph of a Polaroid photograph in a state of non-development. An image had not yet emerged from the pearlescent murk of its photographic substrate. Brian was raving about the book, telling me it was incredible in the way it described the political and philosophical consequences of the blank page. And I was very excited about this proposition. So a few days ago, as I sat down to clarify my thoughts for this very presentation, I decided to Google No Medium PDF. Immediately, a complete copy of the book flooded through my ADSL connection, landing, stuttering, as it downloaded page by page into my open browser. I was dumbfounded, as I always am, by the ease and rapidity with which I could secure this text. I started peeling through the numbered pages, stacked vertically, end to end in virtual space. I felt the ecstasis and pleasurable warmth of identification, as many of my own hunches and tendencies were recognized in this text. I also felt the warm pleasure Brian must have experienced as he gleaned from the pages a satisfying validation of his own approach. As I was skimming this book, No Medium, I came across one particular quotation. There is essentially no object that exists outside the act of retrieval. The demand for access creates the object. It was this quotation that demanded I recount its journey to me, to you here today. To retrieve this quote for you here now, I also had to retrieve its container, No Medium, which was in turn housed within the very specifically lit dwelling of Brian Fuata, whose oeuvre at this moment of transmission to you is actually housed within me. I am, for this brief moment, the archon of this archive house, this house of memory, in which I house my acquisitions, both the custodian of things and the manager of those things' use and interpretation. As a contemporary artist, I am really always drawn towards how I can reuse, reassemble and repurpose information that already exists, information that is housed in all different types of archives. But I'm particularly interested in how those archives reside in my body as I receive them, ingest them and process them, and then how they can escape my body in material form or idea form. I want to talk about two particular works in To You that I've made that kind of deal with these problems. And just as an aside, my father is a steel sculptor, and I've always been horrified by the heftiness and weight of his output as an artist. And so my output I try to reduce to almost nothing. So, so if you notice my work is quite immaterial, very light on, that is why. But it does also speak to how we deal with these growing archives, both digital and real, and where we house them, especially, as I mentioned before, the veracity and breadth of the information grows so much with each day of our digital existence. And furthermore, my background as an artist is in performance and body practices. So within my practice, there is this very strong sense and attachment to the idea of the ephemeral and the embodied. And so you'll also notice that in these two works I'm describing. And at the core of most of my works is a negotiation of how the way we embody, understand and receive information is so to do with power. And how these archives, as Kathy so brilliantly outlined, have within them very specific and particular power structures that are the product of the day they were acquired, collected and then contextualized. So the first work I'm going to talk about is called Every Artist Remembered, and it's a work I started in 2009, and I was just actually still in art school. But I really wanted to make a work that tried to come to grips with the my place in art history, and also the kind of I wanted to find a way to circumnavigate basically the canon, basically the art history that I was being taught by my teachers and also by the books in the library. I wanted to localise my particular knowledge of Australian art, and I wanted to think about it through the voices of other artists. I also wanted to think about how we come to shape our knowledge, and if we're in dialogue, what happens when we allow that conversation to happen, where our knowledge can actually take us. So this work was a series of 19 conversations. Each conversation took 2 hours. It happened in 2009 at First Draft Gallery, which is an artist-run space. And then in 2011 at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne. So it had 2 different iterations. The second iteration was a little less urgent, because I was a bit older and my youthful enthusiasm had begun to dry up a little. But each conversation, so the exhibition opened and there were 9 blank large sheets of paper, as you can see here. And throughout the exhibition's duration, I would have 2-hour conversations with a series of invited artists. In this image, I'm having a conversation with Richard Goodwin. So as the exhibition continued, these maps of names would accumulate throughout the duration. The task that I gave these invited artists was to remember every artist. And of course, that task is not possible. Making it harder was the fact that they had to remember every artist in dialogue with me. I asked that each artist's name be related to the name that was uttered before it. So in some way I saw it as a kind of carving of a canyon through the mass of historical information we hold within our bodies. In 2009, actually, we didn't really have mobile phones with the internet on them, but there was also no, you couldn't do any, what's it called? Like, it wasn't an open test, so you really had to be present completely in the moment with that other artist. I was beginning to think about how easy information is to access on the internet and to try and hold us back from that urge and to really bring us into presence in dialogue with another human. This is me doing the work again in 2011 at ACCA. Another thing that was very important to me was this idea of a public remembrance. And as each name was uttered, there is some sense of reverence towards that artist for that brief moment. These artist names that were remembered were artists that are not necessarily written about in books in libraries. They don't have monographs printed on them. They were artists that perhaps someone had met at art school that had never been recognised in any serious way, artists that had passed away. Artists, the definition of artist was very, very open, and I asked the person I was remembering with to define for themselves what artist meant. And so in the end, we collectively remembered about 5,000 names across the 19 works. One thing that's very apparent in these remembrances of these names is that there is a very obvious limit to my own knowledge. So as a young artist, I obviously didn't have a huge archive to draw on myself. So I would begin to have to repeat names or often inquire when the other artist I was working with would say a name, I'd have to inquire about who that artist was and, you know, see if I could find any traction with how to remember the next name. I would scribe the names down as they were uttered. So I would say a name, I'd write it, then the other artist would say a name and I would write it. And the shape of the drawings was very much an idea of the marks being made in a kind of all-over canvas way. So I like the way these kind of begin to echo kind of the mark making of abstract expressionism. Each name becomes a gesture. Also for the viewer, I like the way it reconstructs history. So you can begin to see names that are perhaps a local Australian female artist next to someone like Donald Judd. And you can begin to see a chronological image of historicisation of art. And that I give that agency to the viewer to make those connections. Of course, some artists remembered more names than others. Every remembrance is hued by the particular position of the participant. The one with Mike Parr is incredibly rich on performance art, Eastern European performance art, whereas the one with, say, male sculptor Ron Robertson Swan is very limited to a very specific milieu of male sculptors. So you begin to see how everyone's history is incredibly unique, and how we all see history is completely hued by our own experience of the world. So there's 17 of these. You can see the whole range of them on my website if you'd like to have a look. And they're now, what I find very satisfying about them is that they're now acquired by institutions across Australia. So they have they've entered the canon in some way and have taken on a role of historicising Australian art, which to me is very exciting for them. So that's Every Artist Remembered, this idea of what resides within us, what can we bring out, what types of histories can we bring out when we're asked to. The next work I want to talk about I made in last year, 2015, and I made this work for a performance art festival in New York called Performer. This work kind of works in the opposite direction. I take a highly canonised conceptual artist, Lawrence Weiner. I'm not sure if any of you know him, but he's a West Coast conceptual artist, a male artist par excellence, full of aphoristic sayings and basically just truth utterances. He makes very large text work that's plastered across the walls of most major institutions internationally. I was very interested in, he's actually been quite influential to me, and his legacy is very present in my work when I work with text. And I found the gravitational pull of this male artist quite frustrating. Like, why am I continually absorbed and seduced by this voice in art history? And I began to watch YouTube videos of him. particular YouTube videos on UbuWeb. I'm not sure if any of you know this archive, but this is a very fascinating part of this archive conversation. It's a online resource of avant-garde material run by Kenneth Goldsmith, who's a conceptual poet. And it's a free to access, free to run, not free to run, but run entirely without advertising or any donations, the most largest accessible archive of avant-garde material, both of primary activities of artists and also of their secondary activities. So you might see, you know, Joan LaBarbera, who's a vocal, expanded vocal technician. You might see her poems on there. You see people's different types of outputs. Anyway, so Lawrence Weiner, I began watching these videos of him giving talks, and I was like, he's so charismatic, how annoying. Like, I'm still listening to him. And what I noticed about his charisma was so much about it was the rhetorical delivery of his kind of espousal of knowledge, and so much was in his hand gestures. So I began to try and think about his hand gestures and find a way to categorize them. And this came into so this was my first attempt at noting the relationship between his hand gestures and what he was saying out of his mouth. So this is literally coming at the archive from the very opposite direction, from the internet, from found footage on YouTube. Then with this information, I began to boil it down, and I began to find general categories of how he used his hands. So from all the YouTube videos, I garnered different types of gestures that he repeated over and over again. And from each of these gestures, I gave a name. And then these names were offered, so it was like a whole schema, a vocabulary I made up about Lawrence Weiner. And then from that vocabulary, I taught a choir how to interpret each hand gesture as a particular vocal instruction, working with a composer, Megan Clune. So what I wanted to do was somehow disembody Lawrence's legacy, disembody the weight of this patriarchal male figure in art history. Then so this is actually in a run-through in Sydney at Performance Space. I had this figure here, this girl in the foreground. She acted as the transmitter, and so she like a conductor. I actually was using a kind of structure of Byzantine choral tradition where the knowledge is kept in the hands. So the choir understood what she was doing, but all she was doing was interpreting Lawrence Weiner there. So that's just the found footage of him. And so this is the performance of this work in New York. And here you'll see Brian Fuada again performing the prologue, which he explained how this work kind of operates. And then this is the choir singing the sound of Lawrence Weiner's conceptualism. And you can see that all their costumes are made. So everything about this work is kind of made from repurposed stuff I found on the internet. So the costumes have huge prints of Lawrence Weiner's hands that I just grabbed from YouTube videos. And the transmitter in this case was actually Joan LaBarbera, who is actually a preeminent, most incredible female legend of vocal expander technique. So to have her transmit and transmute this information was like the most incredible outcome for the project. I'd love to show you just a brief excerpt of the sound of that if we have 1 minute. Do we have 1 minute? And now I do this. And I think the volume should be on. And it's interesting to know that Lawrence Weiner absolutely knew about this project, and I had conversations with him about it. He was very excited about this iteration. And also that Brian knew that I was speaking a lot about it today.
but not one on top and not one on the bottom. They're all concentric. And ever so much is that point when you know that you have enough.
So I asked Ryan to take the language of Lawrence Weiner and embody it in this section.
Getting that thing in that hole when you have a song to sing, when you pointed the gun. Repeat the logic.
Thank you very much.
I'll try not to move my hands in case someone interprets them. Do we have any questions for any of our panellists? We've got time for a couple. Are you all desperate for morning tea? I was interested, Agatha, what was challenging for you about what Kathy was saying?
Just the idea of who, and it reappears in my work a lot, like who, if I'm using appropriated imagery or even gestures, whose, what is the limits of that when that becomes an abusive kind of act? And I try and make it very explicit and transparent. And I think even at the beginning of my talk, I wanted to make it very transparent that I'm aware of that. But I think the history of appropriation in art is very attenuated towards these issues around appropriation. So, and copyright especially. So that's, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yes, is that?
Towards the end, you made a reference to the speaker being aware of the work that you were doing.
Oh yeah.
Could you expand a little bit? Was it a negotiated discussion, or how did it come about?
Yeah, actually, I felt very stand up. I don't know where I'll stand. I felt I'd actually had, who asked that question there? I'd had, the work actually came about because in 2009 when I first went overseas for the first time, I actually had been working on his hands already, like making videos, and he happened to be at LA airport when I arrived. And so I opened my laptop and showed him this research I'd been doing about his hands. So we had this kind of very intimate exchange, and I felt like that was the thing that led me to make the work and propelled that work into being. I only make works when they are really propelled into being, because it takes quite a lot of effort to be bothered doing anything. so they really have to come to being. And then once I decided to work with Performer, they, and that's a New York-based organisation, he's based in New York, they opened up the conversation with him again. And I just wanted to make it very clear to him what I was doing and why I was doing it. And he, of course, was found that it was a site of play, I think, and he was excited by that practice of play. So that's, he didn't come to the performance though, because he wanted, he was in New York at the time, but he wanted to allow that, give Agatha that space.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to get both of the speakers' comments on the number of times that they mentioned power in each of their talks. Even in the quote from Tiffany Jenkins, obsessing about past wrongs is to miss the power of culture. And I think Professor Bowrey's comments were all about the power and the lack of power on the part of the Aboriginal artist. And Agatha actually said that the way in which we receive and embody information is to do with power. Can I just ask you to expand? Where does this power lie in your opinions, or does it differ? Do you have power as the artist?
Yeah.
You know,
So I think my work is about trying to reclaim some of that agency and to be conscious and make visible the ways in which that, to make explicit those structures that create those power structures. So like if I know particular knowledge is created in particular ways, say like there's a big monograph, this is just a very basic example. I have this really big monograph on Lawrence Weiner that I've been lugging around for 10 years, and that the weight of that physically, but also in my library and in my the size, the scale it takes up, and the weight of his presence in me is enormous. I'm like, why is that? And that's because a very particular series of negotiations have been made possible because of his privileged position. So like, because he's a white male practicing in the middle of the 20th century in a very particular practice in a very particular place. Now I just want to say, hang on, what is that series of privileges that has come to that point where I, a young female artist in Australia, am willing to acquiesce to this huge book? Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
But what about the first Professor Bowrey? What about her concept of the power that you mentioned?
Okay. Kind of a weak space. So I'm trained as a lawyer, and I teach first year law, and one of the things you actually do is trying to talk about that power is actually mediated institutionally, and that's not just through law, but there's a whole range of structures. So my approach to law is always about trying to actually draw that out to people who are aware of that in a general sense, but not necessarily to make it too concrete, to particularize where those points are, where it's very obvious that there's a position of power which is quite hierarchical. But the other thing I was trying to draw out in my talk was that cultural power is actually based in those more amorphous things, the stories that we actually tell, and the identities that we all develop based on our exchanges. And so I was trying to find a way to connect those two things, because we tend to think of, I guess, stories as to do with art, culture, humanities, and we tend to think of the institutional stuff, and the law is somehow separate from that. And I guess most of my work is about trying to actually look at the way in which those two sometimes support each other, sometimes support particular stories over others.
It's really interesting you said that, because there's this relationship between stories and law and how we might think of them as discrete, but of course they're not. And I was going to read this very long quote. It's Derrida as well, so sorry. But can I just read it? It's quite interesting. Just the meaning of archive, its only meaning comes from the Greek archaion, initially a house, a domicile, an address, the residence of the superior magistrates, the archons, those who commanded. The citizens who thus held and signified political power were considered to possess the right to make or represent the law. On account of their publicly recognised authority, it is at their home, in that place which is their house, that all the official documents, the archives, are filed. The archons are first of all the document's guardians. They do not only ensure the physical security of what is deposited and of the substrate, they are also accorded the hermeneutic right and competence. They have the power to interpret the archives. Entrusted to such archons, these documents in effect speak the law. The dwelling, this place where they dwell, permanently marks this institutional passage from the private to the public. I thought that was, yeah.
It's about the first bit of Derrida I can understand.
Yeah, no,
I think that's one last thing.
One thing, which was one of the things that I should have mentioned as well. There is the reality that there is actually Aboriginal law, which is actually has something to say about all these relations that we're talking to, and it's still not even on the page in Australia.
Yeah.
Well, I do think people look at libraries as being very neutral spaces, our collections as neutral spaces, and I think to your point of power, and clearly they're not, and they represent so many complex things, and part of, I suppose, this symposium is trying to tease out what that ethic of collecting and how we disseminate and how we talk about those power structures. The implicitly, which we kind of never make explicit, so I think that's what we're trying to do today. Now there's morning tea outside and we're back at 11. So thank you.